The Kennedy years of 1961 to 1963, or Camelot years as some mistakenly call it, were some of the most breath-holding, suspensive moments our nation had ever known. With the tense Cold War between the two superpowers of the United States and USSR, as well as the recent advent of nuclear weapons, both powers faced off in a competition of ideologies, prestige, proxy wars, and conflicting interests. The election of 1960 was one of the closest elections in U.S. history, with Kennedy winning by only 100,000 votes. In the majority of Protestant United States, Kennedy was a Catholic and a relative newcomer to politics. On the other hand, Richard Nixon had experience serving as vice president under Eisenhower, and had massive support in the Bible Belt South. At first, it was believed that Nixon's religion and experience would make him a clear landslide winner. However, Kennedy's victory in Wisconsin, a heavily Protestant state, proved otherwise. The first televised presidential debates in U.S. history were held in the 1960 election, which ultimately proved to be Nixon's downfall. Although a skilled debater and a skilled politician, the television allowed the public to see him become very nervous and sweated heavily under the hot lights. For the 1960 presidential campaign, civil rights had emerged as a crucial issue. Just a few weeks before the election, Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested while leading a protest in Atlanta, Georgia. John Kennedy phoned Coretta Scott King to express his concern, while a call from Robert Kennedy to the judge helped secure her husband's safe release. The Kennedys' personal intervention led to a public endorsement by Martin Luther King Sr., the influential father of the civil rights leader. Across the nation, more than 70% of African Americans voted for Kennedy, and these votes provided the winning edge in several key states. While Nixon focused on his experience and promised to combat communism, Kennedy instead focused on character. While Kennedy was serving in the Pacific, a Japanese naval destroyer rammed his PT boat and snapped it in two. After, Kennedy managed to save several of his crewmates, and then swam from island to island until he found a group of natives to deliver his distress message. Courage and character became Kennedy's main strong points, and he won both the popular and electoral votes. Kennedy was elected at a very interesting time in human history. The competition between the United States and Soviet Union as the first two world superpowers was practically inevitable, as both sides clashed between the ideas of capitalism and communism. By the end of 1945, 16 years prior, any friendly affiliation between the two nations as former allies had deteriorated. To understand the crisis in Berlin, one must have a base understanding of the history of the situation. As World War II came to an end, the Western powers and the Soviet Union raced to the Nazi capital of Berlin. When the war ended, the Soviets controlled the western half, while the Western nations, ironically, controlled the East. This effectively enforced the imposed divisions of the Allies' London Protocol of 1944, then without France, which was under Nazi occupation and Vichy rule. The Soviets, however, losing an estimated 20 million civilians and soldiers to war, famine, and disease caused by Nazi Germany, demanded total control of Berlin as part of a form of reparation. The Western powers, fearful to give any ground to communism, refused. To counter this, the Soviets blockaded all rail, road, and water access to Allied-controlled areas of Berlin, halting essential food and fuel shipments in an effort to force the Western powers to give up West Berlin. In retaliation, the US and UK began airlifting massive shipments of fuel and food into West Berlin, landing supplies in 30 seconds. After more than a year and over 2.3 million tons of cargo successfully airlifted, the Soviets lifted the blockade, realizing that it had failed. The blockade was a poor Soviet decision, amping up Cold War tensions, and publicly gave the impression of the USSR as a cruel power to the world. By 1949, NATO had been formed. In 1961, the Soviet Union put up the Berlin Wall overnight on the 13th of August. West Berlin was a geographic loophole in which thousands of East Germans had been fleeing to the democratic West. Many of the refugees were skilled laborers, professionals, and intellectuals, which wreaked havoc on the East German economy and looked terrible for national prestige. The Soviet Union, despite being a massive power in national production, had very little logistical support to the territories to whom it newly occupied under the Iron Curtain. Soviet Foreign Minister V.M. Molotov also rejected the Marshall Plan in a meeting with the U.S., U.K., and France on June 27, 1947, which promised financial aid to the war-torn nations of Europe. Molotov stated that the Russians could not tolerate such aid to a recent enemy that had devastated such vast swaths of the Soviet Union, and that if aid were given, demanded that the Soviet Union have full control over such funds given to East Germany. When Molotov realized that neither of his British or French counterparts shared his objections, he stormed out of the meeting. The Soviet press claimed that the American program was a plan for interference in the domestic affairs of other countries, and the Soviet government pressured its Eastern European allies to reject all Marshall Plan assistance, which succeeded. From the Soviet perspective, its refusal to participate in the Marshall Plan indicated its desire to remain free of American economic imperialism and domination, as well as financial aid from an economic system that was considered to be an arch enemy and political opposite. As a result of the occupation and communist economy, East Berliners had little supplies, and very little freedom. Jobs were decided for you, and the East German police had a file on almost every citizen, with many informants. By the time the wall came down in 1989, many East Germans flocked to embrace Western values and visit their countrymen. As tensions increased, both the USSR and USA sought to bring more countries under their sphere of influence, and outdo the other. Both nations and their populations at times felt that war was an inevitable fate. However, unlike previous wars, the advent of nuclear weapons had changed the playing field. Now, war was not simply a shift in power from one hand to another, or defeated to conqueror, but could bring about the literal destruction of the world and annihilation of potential hundreds of millions. A new military chess game of checkmate began with strategic placement of nuclear weapons in launch time, range, and nuclear strength. With the possibility of war looming over the horizon, both nations also ramped up their military capacities and production, investing in standard conventional weapons such as tanks, planes, and ships. The Cold War would lead to a new stealth and cat-and-mouse games between newly produced Soviet and U.S. submarines especially, which had ballistic missile capabilities and could travel relatively undetected near enemy installations or territories. In this chess game of missile superiority, the United States then saw an upper hand over the Soviet Union and placed nuclear missiles in Turkey. The decision could not have been more disastrous. As a strategic position, the place was perfect. Turkey lay just south of Russia beyond the Black Sea, right in the Soviets' backyard. But as a political move, it would have been similar if the Soviet Union had placed nuclear missiles across from the Great Lakes or in Greenland. Such a move can only increase the tensions tenfold and would force the Russians to acquire their own equal advantage. In this case, Cuba. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a communist revolution against the military dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista and kicked out American corporations by nationalizing them. For years, United States corporations had taken advantage of the overseas nation and produce, and had brought corruption, gambling, drugs, and prostitution as moneymakers. After the revolution, he brought electricity to the countryside, provided full employment, limited the amount of land a person could own, as to prevent agricultural serfdoms and complete control of agricultural land to businessmen, and advanced education and healthcare. However, he also closed down all opposition newspapers, jailed thousands of political opponents, abolished private businesses, and made no move towards elections. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April of 1961, considered the perfect failure, was done by 1,400 CIA American-trained exiled Cubans. The new President Kennedy believed that such an invasion would show Russia, China, and skeptical Americans that he was serious about winning the Cold War. The plan involved the first stage of destroying the tiny Cuban Air Force with bombing raids, before then sending in the landing craft covertly and sparking revolution all over the island. To put it bluntly, the invasion was a complete and utter clustercluck. Castro had been informed prior to the invasion, and his air forces moved out of harm's way. Although the invasion force hoped to remain concealed without notice, an unspotted radio station on the beach aired the events and details to all of Cuba. unexpected coral reef sank some of the landing craft, and backup paratroopers landed in the wrong areas. Although the Cuban Exile Brigade had hoped for assistance from the U.S. military, Kennedy was not too keen to start World War III in such a small affair. In less than a day, Castro had the invaders pinned on the beach, and they surrendered. The invasion inflamed tensions to all-out heights, both to the Soviet Union for a direct, albeit small, direct attack on a communist country, and to the United States, that grew more concerned of the tiny island under their noses. Eager for military and economic support from the only other major communist nation capable of providing assistance, Cuba turned to the Soviet Union, which was eager for a strategic equivalent to the U.S. missiles in Cuba. In July of 1962, Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union reached an agreement with Fidel Castro to place Soviet missiles in Cuba to deter any further invasion attempts. Construction of several missile sites began in late summer and were discovered by U.S. intelligence, who also spotted Soviet bombers on surveillance flights. Fearful of such strategic positioning, right up the rear of the United States, Kennedy ordered an immediate naval quarantine. As tensions increased, the U.S. military reached DEFCON 3, later DEFCON 2, meaning war involving the Strategic Air Command was imminent. Attempted communication between Khrushchev and Kennedy continued, but to little avail and a stalemate. At the height of the crisis, Kennedy feared that only a full-out military invasion of Cuba could remove the missiles. However, the crisis then took a dramatic turn for the hopeful. ABC News correspondent John Scalia reported to the White House that he had been approached by a Soviet agent suggesting that an agreement could be made. Khrushchev sent Kennedy an emotional message that evening on October 26th and presented a proposed resolution. A small excerpt from the message stated, "If there is no intention to doom the world to the catastrophe of thermonuclear war, then let us not only relax the forces pulling on the ends of the rope, let us take measures to untie that knot. We are ready for this." The next day, a U-2 U.S. spy plane was shot down over Russia, and tensions escalated once more. Khrushchev sent another message that any proposed deal must include the removal of the U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Attorney General Robert Kennedy then met secretly with Soviet Ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin, and said that the U.S. was planning to remove its nuclear missiles from Turkey soon. The next morning, on October 28th, Khrushchev stated publicly that Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. After the Soviets agreed to remove their bombers, the U.S. naval quarantine ended, and U.S. nuclear missiles were removed from Turkey in April of 1963. The crisis had been averted. In an effort to prevent such a crisis of near-nuclear holocaust and annihilation from happening again, a direct telephone link from the White House to the Kremlin was established, which became known as the Hotline. Having approached the brink of nuclear conflict and the destruction of the world, as a nuclear war would send vast amounts of carbon into the atmosphere from burning cities and obscure the sun, effectively creating the next ice age, both superpowers began to reconsider the nuclear arms race. And now, finally, the last cluster cluck. Starfish Prime, the code name given to the testing of a 1.4 megaton nuclear missile 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth from Johnston Island in the Pacific Ocean by the United States of America. It created a massive EMP, or electromagnetic pulse, that blew out hundreds of streetlights and created telephone outages as far as Hawaii, about 900 miles to the northeast. Radio blackouts, satellite failures, and airplane electrical shortages also followed. In the sky, atoms and molecules absorbed the energy of the electrons by the blast and responded by glowing, creating an artificial hellish red and orange aurora. Many of the electrons from the blast remained in space for months and created an artificial radiation belt high above Earth's surface. On August 5th, 1963, representatives of the United States, Soviet Union, and Great Britain signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited the testing of nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, or in the atmosphere. It marks some of the first real collaboration between the US and USSR, as both tried to understand the other's intentions to give one another space. The signing of the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty took place one day before the 18th anniversary of the first ever dropping of an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, in World War II, where it all began.
In the 1960s, America was in a recession. John F. Kennedy believed that increased prosperity would help eliminate some of the nation's social problems. In 1963, Kennedy called for dramatic tax cuts for middle-class Americans as a way to put more money in the pockets of more people. At the same time, he increased the tax burden on wealthier citizens. Kennedy's economic initiatives jump-started the tremendous economic growth of the late 1960s. To address poverty abroad, Kennedy suggests two foreign aid programs. The Peace Corps, which allowed volunteers to travel to developing nations to give assistance, and Alliance for Progress, which offered economic and technical assistance to Latin American countries.
The launching of the satellite Sputnik by the Soviet Union in 1957 called into question American technological superiority. Although Congress created NASA in 1958, the Soviet space program remained several steps ahead of the American program. On April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. As a result, Kennedy says the U.S. will send a man to the moon. A month later, on May 5, 1961, Alan Shepard became the first American to enter space. Kennedy committed the U.S. to landing a man on the moon by 1970. On July 20, 1969, NASA lands the first man on the moon, Neil Armstrong.
While progress was being made on the new frontiers of space exploration and international aid, many Americans suffered at home. In 1962, the problem of poverty in America was brought to national attention in Michael Harrington's book, The Other America. Harrington profiled the 50 million people in America who were just getting by each year on less than $1,000 per person. Throughout the South, demonstrators raised their voices in what would become some of the most controversial civil rights battles of the 1960s. He called for a national assault on the causes of poverty and ordered Robert Kennedy's Justice Department to investigate racial injustices in the South. Finally, he presented Congress with a civil rights bill and a proposal to cut taxes by over $10 billion.
Four Days in November is a documentary based on the November 22, 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Combinations of news footage, archival film, photographs, and recreations of locations and events are included in this film. Director Mel Stewart creates an emotional documentary which has a feeling of immediacy as if it were presently taking place. Stewart's attention to detail within this film gives the observer an inside look at the weapon Oswald used and where he hid it on the day of the assassination in Dallas, Texas.
The suspicious order of events made people question if Oswald was part of a conspiracy. In 1963, the Warren Commission investigated and concluded that Oswald had shot the president while acting on his own. Later, in 1979, a second thorough investigation concluded that Oswald was, indeed, part of a conspiracy. Investigators also said that there could have possibly been two people who had fired at the president. Numerous other people have made investigations. After the Kennedy assassination, Americans learned that their system of government is remarkably sturdy.
War on Poverty. Larger legislative reform program passed by Johnson, known as the Great Society. The Great Society was a set of domestic programs in the United States which set out to eliminate poverty and racial injustice. It ultimately limited in its effectiveness by the economic resources consumed by the country's increasing involvement in the Vietnam War. 1964 election, Democratic President Lyndon B. Johnson was against Barry Goldwater, Republican. 7 out of the 50 states voted for Goldwater, while the rest voted for Johnson. Education. There were 60 separate bills that provided for new and better equipped classrooms, minority scholarships, and loans for student loans. Healthcare. Medicare was created to offset the costs of healthcare for the nation's elderly. It also guaranteed healthcare to every American over 65. Housing. In 1966, Congress adopted the Model Cities Act to assure adequate housing, attack urban blight, set up a cabinet-level Department of Housing and Urban Development, and begin a program of rent supplements. Johnson also pledged to qualify the poor for new and better jobs, extend health insurance to poor and elderly to cover hospital and doctor costs, and to provide better housing for low-income families. Also, an Omnibus Housing Act provided funds to construct low-income housing. The environment. On November 21, 1967, Johnson signed the Air Quality Act, which granted the government increased authority to control air pollution. The act designated a regional approach to combating air pollution, something many thought would be difficult to enforce. Congress then passed the Clean Air Act, which laid out a nationwide standard for pollution control. Cars are 99% cleaner for common pollutants now than in 1970. Johnson also tried to push for an act that would establish and enforce water quality standards for interstate waterways, and the Endangered Species Act, which provided threatened animals with limited protection for the first time. This was called the Water Quality Act. He then signed another act that preserved 9.2 million acres as federal wilderness areas. This was known as the Wilderness Act. Consumer protection. The Great Society came up with a lot of laws to protect consumers, such as Consumer Product Safety Commission and the Child Safety Act. This would ensure that toys, medicine bottles, and other products were safe for both children and adults. It would ban other toys and or products if they were considered dangerous or hazardous. Everything has a label on it and says if it's dangerous to the consumer, such as a pack of cigarettes, the warning label on it says, "Caution, cigarette smoking may be hazardous to your health." This is because of Johnson's act. Immigration. On October 3, 1965, Johnson signed the Immigration Act. By signing the act, a number of immigrants from Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world increased dramatically. However, this act also restricted the number of immigrants allowed in the United States each year. In 1965, people obtained legal permanent resident status, and in 2012, 1.03 million people became legal residents. Reapportionment, the redistribution of representation in a legislative body. Miranda versus Arizona. Miranda was arrested and charged with rape and murder. His sentence was 20 to 30 years per case. Mr. Miranda was an immigrant, and although the officers did not notify Mr. Miranda of his rights, he signed a confession after 2 hours of investigation. The signed statement included a statement that Miranda was aware of his rights. Miranda rights were created in 1966 as a result of the United States Supreme Court case of Miranda versus Arizona. The Miranda warning is intended to protect a suspect's Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer self-incriminating questions. The wording used when a person is read the Miranda warning, also known as being Mirandized, is clear and direct. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me?
The Peace Corps, which allowed